There was something sacred in the way his mother's hands folded at the dinner table. Before any meal, before a single bite, she would pause. Her fingers gently interlaced, her eyes closed, her lips whispering a prayer not for food alone, but for peace, for love, for a world that often forgot to pray. He was just a boy then, but even at that age, he could sense the weight of her words in the silence that followed. His name echoed softly in those quiet moments, not shouted, not commanded, but spoken with affection, as if spoken to heaven itself. Raised in the heart of a devout Catholic home, he wasn't merely taught faith, he breathed it. It was in the candlelight flickering during evening prayers, in the scent of old wooden pews, and in the Latin hymns that floated through the air like soft incense on Sunday mornings. But more than the rituals, it was the strength of his father that left the deepest impression. A man of firm convictions but gentle spirit, his father carried his Bible like it was an extension of his own soul. In a world that often pressed down on them, it was faith that held them upright. Through storms, loss, and the quiet struggles that never made the news, they endured, not by luck, but by something stronger: belief. As a young boy, he listened intently to stories of saints and martyrs, their courage, their sacrifice, their undying devotion. His heart would stir with something unnameable, a yearning perhaps to belong to something eternal, something bigger than himself. He didn't understand it then, but there was a seed growing quietly in him, a call not yet heard, but already planted. At school, he often felt out of place. The other kids talked about cartoons, sports, and gadgets, while he found wonder in the sky's silence, in the feel of pages turning in ancient books, in the mystery of prayers spoken just above a whisper. It wasn't that he was different. It was that he was being prepared, shaped quietly by something unseen, something divine. His family wasn't perfect, but they were sincere. They argued, laughed, prayed, and cried together. And in those very human moments, he began to understand that holiness wasn't only found in churches. It was in the way his sister wrapped a blanket around their grandmother's shoulders. It was in his father's tired hands fixing the neighbor's roof. It was in the soft, "I forgive you," after a sharp word. That, he realized, was the gospel in motion. Not just read, but lived. In those formative years, the world outside seemed vast and wild. Yet he walked through it with a sense of sacredness in his steps, as if every sidewalk could become holy ground. Faith wasn't something he had to reach for. It was already with him, a quiet companion, a soft voice guiding him through childhood, through moments of awe and confusion alike. But even in such a loving home, there were shadows. There were questions he didn't dare ask out loud. Why did God allow suffering? Why did good people face loss? Why did faith sometimes feel distant, like a light behind frosted glass? These were thoughts that visited him in the stillness of night, as he lay under his blanket staring at the ceiling, wondering if heaven could hear him breathe. One evening, during a power outage, the house was wrapped in silence and candlelight. His father gathered the family and opened the old Bible. They read aloud together, one verse each. When it came to his turn, his voice trembled, but his heart swelled. The verse spoke of mercy, of a God who knows every tear. In that flickering glow, he felt it, a connection beyond words, beyond understanding, as if heaven had leaned in for a moment to whisper, "I see you." That night he didn't sleep easily. His mind replayed the verse over and over, until the words melted into something more than memory. They became a question. What if my life has a purpose I can't yet see? He didn't have the answer. But from that moment on, he began to look at the world not only with eyes, but with a heart wide open. And while he didn't know it yet, this boy, molded in silence, guided by prayer, wrapped in love, would one day face darkness so thick it would nearly consume him. But he would also discover a light stronger than fear, a truth more powerful than despair. Something was coming, just beyond the horizon. If this story moved something in your heart, we invite you to join our community of light, faith, and inspiration. Click like if you believe in stories that awaken the soul, And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us grow this family of love and reflection. And we'd love to know you. Comment your name and the city you're watching from so we can send you a special blessing in the next video. You're part of something beautiful here. The lights were blinding. Cameras flashed like stars falling from the sky, and voices echoed his name in every direction, not with reverence, but with expectation. He had arrived, not to a sacred place, but to the pinnacle of worldly achievement. Red carpet stretched beneath his feet, champagne glasses clinked in celebration, and everywhere he turned, there was applause. From the outside, it looked like heaven. But inside, something sacred had gone silent. Fame came fast, crashing into his life like a tidal wave. And with it came all the illusions it brings. The belief that recognition equals worth, that applause can quiet the soul, that success is salvation. But none of those things proved true. He tried to embrace the moment. He smiled at the right times, said what the cameras wanted to hear, laughed at parties that felt more like performances than celebrations. Yet every step into that glittering world felt like a step away from himself. It started subtly, a missed Sunday mass, a prayer left unsaid. Then came the rationalizations. I'm just busy. This is temporary. God understands. And maybe he did. But slowly, the warmth he once felt in silence grew cold. The voice that had once guided him grew faint, and the peace that had always lived quietly in his chest was replaced by a hum, constant, noisy, and hollow. He was surrounded by people, yet lonelier than ever. In crowded rooms, he often caught himself looking at exits instead of faces. The laughter around him felt forced, the lights too bright, the compliments too scripted. Something essential was missing. Something he couldn't buy or earn or fake. He turned to the distractions the world so eagerly offered. Parties, praise, pleasure. They were easy to find, harder to leave. He thought they would fill the emptiness, but instead they echoed it back at him louder than before. What he didn't see at first was how pain often disguises itself in indulgence. When the soul aches, it doesn't always cry. Sometimes it clings, numbs, and hides. That's what he was doing. Hiding, behind success, behind the next big project, behind a smile that grew heavier with every passing year. People called him unstoppable, a genius, a legend in the making. But he knew the truth. Every night ended the same way, staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone so admired could feel so invisible, how someone with so much could feel so empty. He missed the silence of his childhood home, the kind filled with presence, not loneliness. He missed the smell of candles after prayer, the soft sound of a rosary slipping through fingers, the feeling of being truly seen, not by the public, but by God. The temptation of the world isn't always loud. Sometimes it's charming. It doesn't always drag you. Sometimes it dances with you until you forget you're lost. That's what had happened. He had danced too long, and the music had stopped. One evening, after yet another award show, he sat alone in a hotel room that overlooked a city glowing with artificial light. The view was breathtaking, but he felt nothing. Not joy, not pride, just a strange emptiness, like standing in front of a beautiful painting you can't feel. He poured a drink, then another. The alcohol didn't comfort him, but it dulled the questions. Questions he used to face with prayer now disappeared into shadows. He began to see it, the slow unraveling of everything sacred within him. Not all at once, but thread by thread, moment by moment. Yet, even in the haze, something remained. Faint, but persistent. Like a whisper at the back of his heart, a memory, a verse, a presence. He didn't reach for it yet, but it hadn't left him. It was waiting, just beyond the fog. He didn't know it, but the silence he felt wasn't God leaving, it was God waiting. Sometimes grace doesn't shout. Sometimes it just stays. Still, patient, gentle, And soon, that stillness would become a mirror, a painful, honest mirror. If you believe in stories that heal and bring people closer to what truly matters, we invite you to be part of our community. Click like, subscribe to our channel, and share your name and the city you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to send a special greeting in our next video, as a sign that you are seen, remembered, and loved. The room was quiet, but his mind roared like a storm. No applause tonight, no lights, no scripts. Just the soft hum of the city below and the sharp sting of everything he had been avoiding. He stood at the edge of the room, barefoot on cold marble, staring out into the dark. The kind of dark that doesn't come from the night, but from within. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of his own thoughts. He could feel the pulse in his neck, the heaviness in his chest. The whiskey hadn't helped this time. Neither had the familiar lies. It'll pass. You're just tired. You'll be fine tomorrow. But he wasn't fine, and he knew it. There are moments in life when the mask slips off completely, when even the most curated version of yourself crumbles under the truth. This was one of those moments. He wasn't the star anymore. He wasn't the man with answers or charm. He was a soul unraveling, and the silence in that room was terrifying. He walked slowly toward the window. 20 floors up, the lights of the city blinked like distant stars. People were out there, living, laughing, loving. But he felt like a ghost watching it all from the other side of glass. Would anyone miss me if I disappeared? The thought wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, flat, like a question he'd already answered. He didn't plan it. It wasn't something he'd written down or rehearsed. It just was. A surrender, not to peace, but to nothingness. And then, something happened. Not a vision, not a thunderclap, nothing loud or grand. It was a memory, a small, fragile one. He saw his mother, long gone now, holding his face in her hands, smiling gently. He remembered how she used to pray for him before bed, even when he was too grown to admit he liked it. He could almost feel her fingers on his forehead, making the sign of the cross, whispering, "You are loved. You are never alone." That whisper echoed louder than any scream. He dropped to his knees, not because he wanted to, because his strength gave out. His whole body shook and he sobbed, not the kind of cry that asks for pity, but the kind that breaks you open. And there, crumpled on the floor in a luxury suite filled with all the world's empty promises, he prayed. It wasn't a pretty prayer. There were no eloquent words, just raw, aching honesty. "God, if you're still there, I'm so lost." The words hung in the air like smoke. No voice answered. No miracle unfolded. But something shifted. A warmth, barely perceptible, began to move through him. Like the memory of sunlight on a cold morning. Like the first breath after being underwater too long. He didn't understand it, but he didn't need to. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel forgotten. There was no booming revelation, only stillness. But within that stillness, he felt seen. He curled into himself and let the tears fall freely, unashamed. Every drop carried a burden he'd held far too long. Regret, guilt, pride, emptiness. And beneath all of that, something tender began to rise. Hope. When the sun began to rise, it wasn't just the sky that changed. It was him. He stood up slowly, not yet healed, not yet whole, but willing. Willing to listen, willing to begin again. And somewhere in the silence of that morning, a question began to form. Soft, but persistent. What if this pain wasn't the end? What if it was the beginning? Days passed, but something had shifted. He no longer moved through the world, numb. The noise was still there, the same flashing lights, the same hollow invitations, the same empty praise. But now, he walked through it as if through a fading echo. What had once dazzled now seemed dull. What had once controlled him no longer had power. And at the center of it all, something new had taken root. Silence. Sacred, calm, and impossibly alive. He didn't know where to begin, so he began with the Bible. It had sat on his shelf for years, unopened, collecting dust like an old souvenir from a time he barely remembered. That night, after returning home, he reached for it not with obligation, but with longing. Like one reaches for the hand of a friend not seen in years. The pages felt heavy in his hands, the text familiar yet new. Words he had once recited now pierced his heart like arrows of light. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He read that verse over and over, not just with his eyes, but with his soul. He wept, not because the words were poetic, but because they were real. They knew him. They recognized him. It was as if they had been waiting, silently, patiently, for him to return. In the weeks that followed, his habits changed. He woke early, not for appointments or shoots, but for prayer. He walked alone through parks at dawn, not to escape, but to feel, to listen, to be. He found himself kneeling, sometimes in churches, sometimes beside his bed, sometimes in parking lots, wherever his spirit ached to reconnect. And with each whispered prayer, each confession spoken only to the heavens, a new peace entered his heart. He started to remember things he'd forgotten, the comfort of faith, the beauty of humility, the safety of surrender. But more than anything, he remembered why he had ever loved God to begin with. It wasn't about rules, or guilt, or appearances. It was about love. A love so vast, so patient, so deeply personal, that even in his darkest nights, it had never let him go. He began reading the Gospels, not as a duty, but as a lifeline. He studied Christ not as a distant figure, but as someone whose pain, whose humanity, mirrored his own. He saw Jesus, not only on the cross, but in every quiet act of mercy, in every broken heart that kept loving, in every lost soul still whispering prayers into the void. One night, as he sat reading in bed, a book fell from his shelf. It landed at his feet with a soft thud, open to a page stained with age and mystery. It was the dolorous Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, a work he barely remembered owning, written by a mystic nun who claimed to have seen the suffering of Christ in visions. He picked it up, intrigued. As he turned the pages, his heart began to pound. The descriptions were vivid, raw, and full of sorrow, but beneath the pain was a heartbeat of immense love. Every word felt like a window, not just into history, but into eternity. He didn't know what it meant yet, but something was awakening again. The more he read, the more he began to see, not with his eyes, but with his spirit. The crucifixion wasn't just a scene from Scripture. It was a love letter written in blood, a moment when the Creator of the universe willingly walked into agony for the sake of redemption. And he, broken and imperfect, was being invited to witness it. Something stirred inside him, a desire, not for redemption alone, but for purpose. What if he could share this story, not as Hollywood spectacle, but as an offering? What if people could see what he was seeing? What if this was the reason for all the pain, all the detours, all the silence? He closed the book slowly, holding it against his chest. His eyes were full of tears, but his heart was full of peace. He looked up toward the ceiling, toward the heavens beyond, and whispered the simplest, most dangerous prayer of all. "Use me." He couldn't sleep that night, not because he was restless, but because something had begun to burn inside him. A gentle fire, not of anxiety, but of calling. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Not the excitement of a new project or the thrill of a career breakthrough. This was different. It was sacred, urgent, alive. The idea was clear. He had to tell the story, not just a story. The story, the one that changed history not through armies or empires, but through surrender, suffering, and selfless love. But how does one begin to tell the greatest love story ever lived? He knew what people would say, that he was unqualified, that he was too flawed, too controversial, too human. But those doubts didn't touch him now, because he knew the truth. Grace doesn't look for the worthy. It transforms the willing. And he was willing. The more he prayed, the more the vision came to life in his heart. This would not be a clean, polished version of the Passion. It would not be a diluted tale to make viewers comfortable. No, this would be raw, honest, visceral. Because love, real love, bleeds. And what Jesus endured was not gentle, it was brutal, it was personal, but it was also beautiful. He began the work with reverence. The research was endless. Old texts, theological commentaries, historical documents, and medical journals. He wanted to understand not just what happened, but how it happened. What a scourging really meant. What crucifixion did to the human body. How much blood a man could lose before he collapsed. He read and reread gospel accounts, studying every word, every pause, every look between Jesus and his mother. He met with priests, rabbis, doctors, historians. He wasn't seeking approval, he was seeking truth. And through it all, one thing became clear. This was not just a film, it was a calling. Each scene he imagined, each line of dialogue, each costume and color, it all flowed from a place that felt higher than his own mind. He would sometimes wake in the middle of the night with ideas, not vague concepts, but detailed, specific instructions. It was as though heaven itself had handed him a blueprint, and his only job was to be faithful in bringing it to life. He gathered a team, not because he wanted control, but because he needed people who believed. Every actor, every technician, every costume designer, they weren't just hired hands. They were part of something holy. They began to build the world, ancient Jerusalem recreated with dust, stone, sweat, and reverence. Costumes were stitched by hand, dyed with natural colors, aged and worn to match the lives of those who would have worn them 2,000 years ago. The cross wasn't a prop, it was a presence. He made the decision early on. The film would be in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, the actual languages of the time. It didn't matter if people called it unmarketable. He wasn't making a product. He was telling a truth. And truth didn't need subtitles to pierce the soul. The resistance came swiftly. Critics labeled the project as extreme. Some mocked him. Others warned him to stop. Doors that had once been wide open began to close. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had already faced his darkest night. What was left to fear? He pressed on. There were moments during production when things went wrong. Equipment failed, actors got injured, schedules fell apart. But strangely, with every challenge, there was also a moment of grace. Someone stepped in, something clicked into place, or a problem turned into a revelation. It was as if an unseen hand was guiding every step, allowing just enough struggle to keep them humble and just enough help to keep them going. One day on set, during a particularly intense scene, a powerful gust of wind swept through the set, knocking over lights and scattering sand into the air. But no one moved. The actors stood frozen, eyes full of tears, as if heaven itself had entered the scene. A silence fell, reverent, holy. That moment never made it into the film, but it changed everyone who was there. This wasn't just about Christ's death, it was about his love. And that love was now flowing through every moment of the project. Every ounce of pain the actors endured, every drop of effort behind the scenes, was an offering, not for awards, not for applause, but for truth, for redemption, for hearts aching to remember what love really looks like. And deep down he knew, this story would not leave people the same. The film was finished, and yet something told him the true work had only just begun. When the final cut was complete, and the last scene faded into silence, he sat alone in the editing room, watching it one more time. Not as a director, not as a creator, but as a man redeemed. He remembered who he had once been, the boy who sat at the dinner table in silent prayer, the man who had nearly ended it all, the lost soul who had cried out to heaven in the dark. And now, here he was. Not perfect, but free, and more than anything, grateful. He knew this film would stir debate. It would make some uncomfortable, others angry. But he also knew it would awaken something sacred in millions of hearts. It wasn't made to entertain. It was made to break chains, open eyes, and remind the world that love, real love, suffers, sacrifices, and saves. When The Passion of the Christ reached theaters, it didn't arrive quietly. It was a storm, a prayer, a cry. Audiences wept, some in silence, others openly sobbing in their seats. Strangers held hands. Families prayed together. People who hadn't stepped into a church in decades felt something rise within them, something ancient and holy and unexplainable. Yes, there were critics. There were arguments. Some called it too violent. Others questioned its message. But he had made peace with that long before, because he hadn't created this film for praise or perfection. He had created it to glorify a love that changed everything. What surprised him most was how many people were ready for it. Men and women from all walks of life, doctors, teachers, prisoners, artists, skeptics, reached out, saying the same thing in different ways. I felt something awaken in me, and that was enough. It wasn't about box office numbers, though the success was overwhelming. It wasn't about headlines, though they were everywhere. It was about souls. About that one person in the back row who thought they were too far gone, feeling maybe for the first time that they were seen, known, and loved. This was the miracle, not the film itself, but what came after. He received letters from people who had forgiven their enemies after watching it, others who had put down their addictions, couples who reconciled, individuals who felt God's presence again after decades of silence. And in his quietest moments, he understood. This was never about him. He was just the vessel, the love that moved through the screen, that broke hearts open and stitched them back together. It was always Christ's. From beginning to end, it always had been. And that love keeps moving, through every person who dares to believe again, through every heart that reopens after pain, through every tear that falls in silence and is caught by grace. That's the legacy, not the fame, not the controversy, not even the film, but the return of hearts to the one who never stopped waiting for them. So if you're reading this now, if something inside you is stirring, don't ignore it. It might just be heaven whispering your name. If this journey touched you, we lovingly invite you to walk even further with us. Click like, subscribe to our channel, and comment your name and city so we can send you a personal blessing in our next video. You are not alone. You're part of a beautiful, growing community of hearts awakening to grace. And now, don't stop here. A new video is waiting for you. One that could open your eyes and bless your soul in ways you never imagined. It's appearing on your screen right now. Just click it and let your spirit be lifted. Thank you for being here with us. Amen.